Good evening. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is the third in a series of landmark lectures. The Labour, Literature and Landmark Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. We are pleased to present this series in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and I'd like to express our appreciation for their help and support. I also want to acknowledge the assistance of our window curator, Thomas Donoghue, who has created a special window display for tonight, and I encourage you all to look at it as you leave. For those of you who might be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen was founded in 1785 by 22 artisans. Today, our 234-year-old organization continues our original mission of continuing to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of New York City. This includes, through our educational and cultural programs, which include our library, of course, to which you're in this evening, the John M. Mossman Locke Museum collection, which is upstairs, and you're welcome to visit afterwards, our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and finally, our lecture series, of which this is part of tonight's lecture is part of nearly 200-year-old history. The 2019 Landmark Series is curated by Lisa Easton, a partner in the New York City-based architectural historic preservation firm, Easton Architects. And to introduce tonight's speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Lisa Easton.
Thank you, Karen. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. The preservation of historic places is more important than retaining a physical landmark. There is an emotional connection with these important places that provides people with a sense of continuity, providing a connection to the past that helps one ground themselves in the present. In a rapidly changing world, historic places provide people with a feeling of being part of a continuum. Preservation as an ideal gives us a sense of orientation to our society, using structures and objects of the past to establish values linked to the time and place of the present. The time and place are defined by traditions that envelop it. The values people hold and the cultural heritage it represents provide stability. Preservation is not about being nostalgic, it's about living in a better present. That we are part of a broader reach that connects eras, creates continuity, and embraces a more cumulative whole. I am thrilled to be a part of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen 2019 Labor, Literature, Landmark Lecture Series. I always love that alliteration. And when asked to curate the 4-part lecture series on landmarks, I wanted to bring together a group of individuals whose expertise captures the essence of preserving our treasured landmarks, from technology of materials and methodology to advocacy and historic research. Tonight, I am proud to introduce our third lecturer in this series, Jean-Francois Furieri. Francois, I call him Francois, is the founder and president of Iconoplast and has over 45 years of experience as a master craftsman and plaster conservator. And personally speaking, I think he's a perfect fit for this lecture series. Based in Toronto, Furieri began Iconoplast in 1986 as the North American branch of his family business, which was founded by his grandfather in Italy in the early 1900s. The company specializes in restoration, preservation, and conservation of ornamental plaster. Furieri's projects include historic theaters and churches, residences, banks, and parliamentary buildings across Canada. He has contributed his expertise to preserving New York's rich theatrical heritage with projects at the Lyric Theater, the Empire Theater, Times Square Theater, King's Theater, and the Manhattan Opera House. He is an expert in the traditional methods of plasterwork, using the depth of his expertise to diagnose problems in historic plaster and to develop new products for plaster restoration. He has lectured widely and educated heritage professionals around the world about the opportunities and pitfalls of plaster. He is a member of the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, International Network for Traditional Building, Architecture and Urbanism, and the International Council on Monuments and Sites. I have the great fortune to be working with him currently on the restoration of the plaster proscenium arch at the New Victory Theater. Francois is an artisan of the highest caliber, fueled by his passion for the art and noble craft of plaster. Tonight it is truly my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Jean-Francois Furieri.
Good evening, and thank you, Lisa, for this very nice introduction. So I would like to start by showing you a short movie which was my introduction to the US market. At the time, I was doing a theater in Savannah, Georgia, and that TV show called me. They needed a plasterer. I had never heard of this old house, and we negotiated, and I told them that yes, I would be glad to do it, but I would have to charge them, and they said, "We are this old house." And I said, "Well, I am Iconoplast." And the secretary just laughed and said, "Don't worry." And I didn't, and here we are. It's just a short, but it shows a process of a beautiful Thomas Lamb theater.
Master Plasterer. Now, in the center of the room, you'll notice a plaster medallion. It looks like it's been here for 100 years. In fact, it's brand new. It is the work of Master Plasterer Jean-Francois Furieri, who for the last several months has been working on the Lucas Theater downtown. Recently, Norm had a chance to check it out.
Careful with the stairs.
Okay. Now we've come in backstage. Wow, this is huge. Most people don't realize how huge the backstage area is. What was this theater used for?
Live entertainment, musical, vaudeville.
Now all the rigging's gone. Is that going to be replaced?
Yes, with state-of-the-art equipment.
Okay. And out here, the house. And it's filled with scaffolding. What's that for?
To have access to the auditorium ceiling?
To do all the restoration of the plasterwork up there?
Yes, and for the other trades as well.
Now it's quite elaborate. You have towers of pipe with beams across, and then on top of the beams, floor joists, and then the whole deck is covered with plywood. So you're right up close to the ceiling to make the work easier.
Yes.
Now you've started at the top. Why start at the top?
For the dust to settle down afterwards.
So you don't want all that new work to get dusty, and all the plaster dust is just going to keep falling down through the process of the job. Now, can you show me some of the condition of the plaster when you started?
We have a good example of the condition of the theater.
Right over here.
Yes, on the proscenium.
Wow, that looks pretty bad. You're actually missing some of the plaster totally. Some of the elements are just hanging here loosely. Some of them are totally gone. What causes damage like this?
Water damages.
And was it from a leaky roof?
Yes, from the roof, and as well accumulation from the floor. And through capillary, it absorbed it.
So it just sucked all that water out. Now, is this as bad as it gets?
We have some parts which get even worse.
Let me see that. Well, we're up here on the balcony level. And from this first balcony, you get a great view of the stage.
Yeah, you sure do.
Now, what's the budget on this job?
Close to $6 million. Just a small part of it is for plaster, though.
Isn't that always the way?
Yes. This is the part I wanted to show you.
Wow. Now, more water?
Yes. The water accumulated at the top of the entablature here and in the trough, and you can see that it just went right through.
So this is actually the inside of the exterior wall of the theater.
Yes.
And the water sat in the trough and just came through and destroyed the plasterwork. Now, the top of the capitals look like they've been damaged.
They were chopped off to hang curtains to hide the damages.
To solve one problem, they've created another problem.
Yes.
That's a shame. Now, it's hard to believe you can even bring this back.
Well, yes, let's have a look what has been completed so far.
Okay.
Now we are at the balcony level.
Wow, this area looks like it's nearly complete. And you really start to see what the transformation is from falling apart to restored. Now, what's going on up there?
He's sealing the composition gold with shellac.
So it's not real gold?
No.
Budget?
Budget.
Okay. Now, how much of the plaster work is restored here?
Everything that you see at eye level is new.
So all of this is brand new?
It's been redone, and about 35% of the rest has been restored.
Well, I must say the quality of the workmanship is really quite extraordinary. The plasterwork looks great, the leafing looks great, and the paint job. It's hard to believe that you can still get craftsmen to do this kind of work.
Yes.
It's also hard to believe that you had anything that you could actually restore left here. Now, where to?
The dome.
Well, now we're up on that platform that we saw from down below. And if you happen to be at the theater and you look straight up, this is what you would see. It is beautiful and so detailed. Look at the animals.
They are griffins, part lion, part eagle.
You can even see the muscles. It's hard to believe that you would have that much detail when you're going to see it from 75 feet away. Now, what amazes me is I wouldn't even know how to go about starting a restoration like this.
Some of the work is done on situ in place where we can restore parts. Some other parts are done in our studio in sections, 4 feet, 6 feet, like those here.
Like this cornice molding.
Yes.
I'd like to see that.
We're doing one right now in our studio.
All right, Francois, what are you doing here?
We're making an extrusion.
So you've got a form.
Actually, this is the counter form.
Okay, and what's that made out of?
Plaster reinforced with burlap.
Okay, I can see the burlap on the end, and it looks shiny. Has it been covered with something?
It has been sealed with shellac and covered with a mix of oil and soap.
So the oil and soap is a release agent so that you can pop the mold out after it's
Exactly.
complete.
Then what we do have is a shell.
Okay, and now you're already starting to install some of the plaster. It's very liquid.
Yes. What I'm doing now is I'm putting my first coat of plaster to mix with the burlap, which is the fiber.
So now you're going to embed that burlap into this first layer of plaster that you've put in your counter mold.
That's right.
And effectively, that's the reinforcement. You're not using steel, you're using burlap.
That's right.
Now, is this an ancient method?
Yes, it's a very ancient method. It has been done like that for centuries.
Looks like fun.
It is fun.
Now, how much time do you have to work with this plaster before it sets up?
About 30 minutes.
I'm surprised to see you just using your hands. I would think that plaster would be very tough on them.
No, actually, there's no lime in plaster. It's alkali-free. Just want to try my thickness. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to run it through to be sure my thicknesses are okay.
So you're not actually making the mold now. You just want to make sure that that burlap isn't going to show through when you finally
That's right.
get to it. Gee, I'd give you a hand, Francois, but I think I'd just make it worse. Where did you learn how to do this?
I'm the third generation. I've learned with my father. That learned with his father.
I guess I'm also surprised that this plaster is so soupy.
Well, it's very liquid. We don't have any lime in it to increase the consistency. You see, we use the plaster raw to do the extrusion. In solid plastering, they would have used a lot of lime, up to a full third of lime to give it body. But in this application, we don't need it. Plus, we have a lot more strength by not putting lime in it.
Well, I guess this is one of the most important tools that you use. You've actually taken a thin piece of metal, cut to the exact profile of the molding you're trying to reproduce, and mounted it in this wooden sled.
Yes.
So you just slide it through the plaster. Now, how many times are you going to do that?
Many times.
Yeah, I think I'd stop right about there. That looks pretty good to me.
There's a few more pulls to have it completed.
I see what you mean now. The edges are starting to get nice and crisp.
And it's still very soft.
I noticed that you wash your hands frequently.
Yes, because the plaster sticks to the hands.
It's like getting a cast.
Exactly.
So now it's getting really hard to pull because it's setting up.
Yes, and I will ask my assistant Thomas to help me.
How many of these could you do in a day?
5, 6 on a good day. Now this technique is the essence of all fibrous plaster work. Whatever you saw in this theater is based upon extrusion technique. All the rest of the ornamentation is then bedded on. That's it.
That's it. So now you're going to take this, set it in place, and then there'll be additional plaster ornaments that will be applied to it?
Exactly.
Well, I want to thank you for showing us this fascinating process, and also to thank you for fixing the ornament over at this old house.
You're welcome.
And here we are. It was a lot of fun to be in Savannah, Georgia. It's a beautiful city. And now, the reason I wanted to show you is because, first of all, it's a theater. I have a passion for theaters. I've restored quite a few. And this is a Thomas Lamb theater. And the technique you saw is typical of all plaster work. I could show you that in this room, a lot of elements were started with those. Though all the background of those was made in the same technique. The background of those was made in the same technique. The abacus, the astragal, all of those, extrusion is the base of the plaster. So now we're going to pass into, I would like to show you, first of all, I like to start to show you, it's about on architects. Please be careful when you issue changing clouds, because sometimes, as you can see, contractors can really get mistaken. It happens. In the history of plaster, plaster has been around for thousands of years. We have evidence in the pyramids of plaster made out of 3-coat in the very same matter than we have now, which is lime, sand, and gypsum, burnt gypsum. The plaster was very fine, and it lasted in the pyramid for all those years. Meanwhile, they were never getting water damage or stressed, but nevertheless, it's over 4,000 years old. And we have some evidence. This is a century, the first century in England, remain of a stucco work. Same thing here, remaining of a stucco work of plaster. The plaster through the century lasted with more or less different approaches. A lot of work was done with stucco, which is an exterior. The term plaster does not always mean gypsum. You can have a plaster wall that has no gypsum composition. Plaster is a technique. The cementing of plaster is quite, has to be very precise. We have here, I just wanted to show you some of the early work from my, before we had 3D printers and so on, how in my father and grandfather's shop, they were making house prototypes, all in clay, some of typical fireplaces, one of a kind, always made by hand. This is a project, I don't know if you have heard, but it's a very exclusive project in the south of France called Port-la-Galère. And the prototypes were made out of plaster for approval, and it followed exactly the same texture and the same. This is the house of the Sheikh Yamani, the former OPEC president. That room was offered to him by the King of Morocco. This is Princess Abdulaziz in Paris. What you see in the swimming pool is not a reflection, it's a mosaic to duplicate the plaster ceiling, and everything is in plaster, starting from here, which is, it's basically an Alhambra interpretation. One of my first projects in Toronto, the Egyptian Theater, all custom fabricated. Those columns were 8-foot diameter. Same thing, the Egyptian Theater in Montreal. Another theater in New Brunswick, a Beaux-Arts. Actually, it was more of a Beaux-Arts theater, an opera house by the sea, quite beautiful. Plaster can be accommodated to do almost every kind of form and shape. Another mosque. Traditionally, in the Islam faith, plaster is a very important part of their mosque. The wall on which all the written scriptures are is called the Qibla. It's oriented towards Mecca, and it's always heavily decorated in plaster and gilded. Recently, I have connected with, via social media, with fellow plasterers from the Middle East. And I was extremely surprised to see their extent of the technique, in the sense that where we would actually make a prototype and clone it, which is basically the work we do one, we clone it. They do not. They actually plaster everything, and everything is carved. They draw, so they have to keep a moist plaster, and they carve it on a daily basis. And they don't use that many tools. They use a long blade, and all the flowers are carved by hand. And the whole dome, the whole ornamentation is done by hand on a lime substrate. Talking about a lime substrate, we're just going to make a small parenthesis about Chapelle 16 and the way it was painted by Michelangelo. There is a lot of mysterious and misunderstanding about fresco. Fresco is a wonderful technique. It opens the door to beautiful interpretations, but it has limited in time. You do not do a whole room like this one and start your fresco. When Michelangelo was working, the plasterer would actually plaster the area that Michelangelo would be painting for that day. And that plaster was called la giornata. And he would paint exclusively what was freshly plastered in, so the carbonation could take its turn. In the fresco, what happens is you have a chemical transformation of the plaster. The plaster absorbs the pigment. It's usually natural pigment. You can achieve the same effect with tempera, but you don't have the same vividness. And at crystallization, it gets its full effect. And I don't know if you have seen lately the Chapelle 16 restored to the original color. It's so vivid, and you see all that blotchiness, which is part of the process. It never was a monolithic composition of plaster, but a mosaic of daily work on plaster. Anyway, here, we can actually do plaster lace. I'm sorry, these are taken from gelatine, old gelatin pieces. We did 30 stores like that. We won the first prize for the stores under 5,000 square feet. The design was supposed to come to the US, but never made it. So another theater. This is a project I'd like to show you to show the extent of what we can achieve with plaster. It's, I won't give any names, it doesn't matter. And it's extreme plaster. It's extreme plaster, you will see. We have 3 different layers of plaster. You can put your hands behind it. Everything is gilded 24-karat gold, and these are only speaker boxes. The whole room. This is a cupoletta, same thing. Everything is gilded. Column from Carrara, Italy, still the same house. That was interesting because the client came in and showed me a photo of a very similar concept, but that came from Sicily, and she wanted the same in Chinese. I'm quoting, and we came up with those designs, quite elaborate. That's the library. We're still talking about the same house. These are 14 feet ceiling, quite extent. Art Deco. These are Art Deco from my grandfather's time. And I still have the original plaster molds, because these were made of plaster mold, on which my grandfather had written modern. It was modern for him. 2 medallions. You see those 2 medallions? They are exactly the same, except one has been used like in the French way, which is you bury, the negative space is buried, the plaster is flush, the background of the molding is flush with the plaster ceiling, where in the other one, it's on appliqué. You can see the dramatic difference for the same thing. This is another theater. This is talking about how plaster can come in many different forms. This subject was quite touching, in the sense that I was contacted by University of Toronto. They had that map of, these are on the left, my daughter and my assistant. This is the D-Day in plaster. It was found at the University of Toronto. It was extremely bad shape. It was all cracked up, and the whole pattern was actually painted with watercolors, so it made it extremely difficult to restore and to clean and to complete the work. And there are names on this map which are memories of very sad time. And this is another project in Toronto. There's Osgoode Hall, one of the nicest Toronto buildings, where you have a very rich vocabulary of ornamentation. This is I wanted to show this project because this is when we put Spider-Man back together. The Lyric Theater went through many changes. When Spider-Man came along in 2009, we got the authorization to remove the proscenium arch, the balcony, part of the cell vault. And it was quite, when I put it back, when I did it the first time, I never planned to take it out. It was never meant to be taken out. So it was quite a bit of a challenge to take it out. But then we had to put it back. And when we put it back, they actually gave us a completely floating scaffold where you can see all the crates and all the work being developed above. It was... this is to show you, this is the Prime Minister's office. This is a good example of when plaster goes bad. Have a look at the detail. What happened is that they had different crews. One crew was in charge of paint removal application, and the other crew was in charge of the paint removal. So you can see that at eye level, these are the texture, the plaster, the only historic plaster left in the building of a few 100,000 square feet. That's the only plaster that was left. And this is how they gave it to us, because they have tried quite a few different companies to restore this plaster, because historic fabric had to remain historic fabric. They didn't want to make molds or have new ones. So basically what we did is, you can see on this one, very labor intensive, because the same with the rosettes. And there were 12 capitals like in that shape. Same thing with the coats of arms. And these are not the worst part, because there were many other ones. And this is what we delivered. That's the same capital, but just retooled. No mold made. Everything was done by hand. And they told us, it shouldn't take you more than 2 weeks. It took us 5 months. But plaster is very sensitive to moisture and to alkali materials. A product like Pillow A1 will actually destroy the plaster. And what happened in this instance is that they actually left the Pillow A1 for months, because the schedule did not allow to have it done differently. And they destroyed it. I don't have the time to show, but same thing with the coats of arms inside the Prime Minister's office, and a tremendous amount of damages in the cornices as well. Oh, this one is the Selwyn Theater, a lobby that has since disappeared when the building collapsed. That was a project for the Empire State Development, where we removed that dome because it was extremely, it was in bad shape. It was about to collapse, so we took it apart. We completely rebuilt it, some part, and this is it finished. When we finished it, when the theater was rebuilt. There are other parts inside that we did as well. This is another application of plaster. I want to show you a Canadian artist called Sherry Boyle. She's probably the most talented Canadian sculptor these days. She's extremely versatile. She works with many different materials. And she appeared one day in my office and told me she showed me a drawing, and she said, I want to do that. And I thought she was joking, because she didn't realize that she wanted to sculpt that in plaster. I said, sure, we can try. So I explained to her how to make a structure, how we develop a structure with foam to control the weight and the shape. And this is Spider-Woman, you will see later. I was doing Spider-Man in New York, and she was doing Spider-Woman in my office. You can see her show here, and this is how it shows. She uses multimedia. Same thing for the other shows for her. We did quite a few different shows, but this is the show I wanted to show you, is because it's she represented, this is her, when we carried the pieces to my shop for the Biennale in 2013. We started from one piece, 10-inch, that was enlarged in foam extremely crudely, and we had to redo all the forms and shape. And it's actually the theme of that sculpture is Snow White. But not Snow White by Walt Disney, but Snow White by the Grimm brothers. I don't know if you know the story. I will spare you the detail. It's quite atrocious. But the work itself was really difficult, because the mermaid had to be 10 feet. And I don't know if you're familiar with Venice, but everything is small. And bringing a 10-foot piece to Venice for the show was a big logistic problem. So we had to come and make it in 2 pieces. And this is just part of the process. This is, we were doing what's called a waste mold. A waste mold is when a sculptor creates a piece, a clay piece, and when we make the mold of it, we actually must destroy the sculpture to have the mold. And then when we make the cast from the waste mold, we must destroy the mold to get the cast. So there's no room for mistakes. And, but sometimes you have very interesting shape because what has to be, it has to be very strong to sustain a lot of mechanical pressure. And interesting shapes for the legs. It's just silicone mold. These are just part of the upper bodies, part of the tail. And this is when we had to design a system to have the pieces made out of 2 pieces. And it worked. She was very happy. The show was a success. We packed everything, plaster, tools. It was delivered, no breakage. This is Sherry Ball in her studio for the full representation. And this is from the Biennale in Venice, representing Canada. Here she is. You can actually see the detail of the... Another kind of waste mold, you can see those weird shapes. Waste mold are quite interesting, and sometimes the result is quite surprising, very technical, and you end up with this that then becomes part of another sculpture. This is a sculpture. I was doing Knox Church in Toronto, and I was really wondering what you had Gothic arches, and you had 2 ornaments that had no business being there, and I could not know what they were doing, but ornaments can be surprising sometimes. The last piece on... that was the last piece for Spider-Man, yes, and created and going away. We have, this is the part where I wanted to come to, talking about the theaters and plaster in general. Most of the people misunderstand that the plaster doesn't have a structure. What you see here is strictly a suspension system. There is no structure. You can turn it into a structure, and that's what we're doing presently at the Times Square Theater, or we've done at the Lyric, or we've done at the Empire Theater, always with the same team, with my conservator and friend Jay Cardinal. You have to work all around this problem of not having a suspension system, of having a suspension system and no structure. And we have had quite a few, you're all familiar with the accident that happened in London, England, about the theater that collapsed. The Apollo Theater collapsed, hurting over 80 people. We have the same conception of construction in New York. It's built in the same way. The problem is that the material used do not last forever. Burlap is known to dry rot. Excelsior is known to dry rot. And there's a very, very interesting article that I would really recommend you to read, and you can reach me by via email. I'll be glad to give you all my sources, by Ronnie Clifford, only because the emphasis he makes on how burlap dry rots, and I would like just to weakening Asian wadding embedded in the ceiling as the cause of the collapse, and recommended the urgent inspection of all suspended ornate ceiling in cities public. Not only they are doing that, it's mandatory now in England to inspect a ceiling, but it must be done by a competent person. And the competency of the person must be very, very defined. Not, of course, the structural engineers, but the quality, The qualification of the plasterer must be established because not all plasterers are equal. Heritage plaster has its own pitfalls, it has its own methodology, and you have plasterers were not exactly all the same, and you have a lot of idiosyncrasies in their materials, in their way of working, their thicknesses, their aggregates. So you really have to understand heritage plaster to be able to assess properly. But it became by law now, you have to have a certificate of viability for your ceiling, for your suspended ceiling, signed by a structural engineer and a qualified heritage plasterer. And it says actually there is just a handful of specialist plastering firms nationwide with the knowledge and expertise to carry this kind of sensitive information investigation. I must say that the Apollo Theater had a clean bill of health from Eltynge House. And Eltynge House is an excellent plastering contractor. There is nothing wrong to be said about them. They are masters at Scagliola. Scagliola are those columns you see here that represent marble. It is not a painted surface. The paint is right through the plaster itself. So it becomes, and I have really quite a big of an abundant documentation concerning the failure of what we have right now in plaster. This is from Historic England. I was in contact with them because they are looking for help to actually address all those issues, because it's not only the 300 theaters that are at risk, it's all the national buildings where you have suspended plaster. It's all made in the same matter. Gypsum, plaster, Asian, and timber are liable to degrade through a variety of processes, often initiated by moisture. Well, and it makes susceptible to biological attack. We all know that plaster, what water does to plaster, and it is quite enlightening to see to what effort they would actually go to ensure that the plaster ceilings will remain in good condition. You must have your certificate signed, and it must be inspected every 5 years by law, which we're not have at all in North America. Once again, this is the ABTT, which is the equivalent of the historical theater. You will go through exactly the same particular attention to be paid to the condition of the attachment of all supporting structural element of the suspended fibrous plaster ceiling to each other and to the primary structure of the building. You can have an excellent building structure, but a very poor plaster suspension system. Anyway, that was, we don't have the time to go through it all. Okay, so now we're going to we're going to talk about the Lyric Theater. The Lyric Theater, circa 1996, J. Cardinal Conservator. This is the original photos that we had to deal with. So you can, the challenge here was that not only we had to take it out, not break it, not making molds, keeping the original fabric, but we had to make it 10 feet wider and 5 feet taller. So that was a bit of a challenge. You can see here that the plaster was bedded in, heavy water damage. You will see later that actually it was in the concrete itself. So when we started cutting, needless to say that lots of dust and metal. This is the work in process. cutting metal, we had to, what you can see here is that the function of these elements is a substructure we attach to the plaster so we can actually remove it. Plaster is mostly sand. A system of plaster is usually 3 coats called brown, scratch, and top. The brown and scratch are usually 3 sand to 1 lime. And most of the time, because of piecework, people could work until 5 to 1. And that weakens the plaster. Not only it weakens it, but they used to make it extremely thick. But the thicker the plaster is, the weaker it is. It is extremely easy to take a piece of plaster of large proportions and have it shatters in your hands because the horsehair is only on the first coat. It's aired only on the first coat, so it has no strength. And keep in mind that plaster was never meant to be removed. So lots of metal work, as you can see. A lot of different structure that we had to add so the plaster, the pieces would not collapse because of their configuration. That was probably the most difficult of the whole project, were those pieces. The pieces were bedded into concrete, but we had promised Judy Salzman that we will remove 100% and salvage 100%. So we did our 100%, and that piece alone took over a week for 2 guys to work in Eltynge. But we did it. And you can see at the last part, this is what you have, a lot of metal. Incidentally, I don't know if you remember that story, but when we took control, I took control of the theater because I was the first contractor, and I had to fill in all the forms and applications and so on. So when we took control of the dome, we took the HVAC apart, and to our biggest surprise, we found hundreds of wallets. Hundreds of wallets, like boxes of wallets, all dating from the 40s and 50s. So we went through the wallet. It was quite surprising. And no, we didn't find any cash. No. But we found so many photos. It was amazing how many photos people would carry. Some wallet had 15, 20 photos. They were that an inch and a half thick. So our client, to make a long story short, we're just across on 43rd by the New York Times. The New York Times heard about the story, and I didn't want to deal with those wallets. I mean, what am I going to do? So we gave them to the New York Times that published an article, and they had actually a wallet day. They actually had people coming to the New York Times head office, and all the wallets were on the table, and some people picked up the wallet and broke in tears because they found their wallets so many years later. What happened was that at the time, the seats were much higher, and you had thieves that would actually crawl under the seats, pick pockets in people's pants or in the purses, walk their way through, take the cash, and had to dispose of the wallet. And they had a big vent, and they were falling into the vent. So that was a very touching moment. I mean, people were so overwhelmed by it. So still removing, that was the screens vault. As you can see, it's quite labor-intensive. Cell vault in progress. We have exactly the same vault at the Times Square Theater. Same plastering contractor, same architecture. This is quite special in our heart. It's the Lyric Theater. Originally, the Lyric Theater and the Apollo Theater were 2 separate theaters. One was the Beaux-Arts, this one. The Lyric Theater was, as you can see the facade on 43rd Street, the interior was exactly the same. Just dropping a box here, okay. Still. Okay. You can see that the Medusa here, you had so much undercut that you can actually put your hands right behind it. The depth of the ornament was phenomenal. This was a typical Beaux-Arts architecture in its grandeur. This is J. Cardinal finding that, yes, indeed, it was a mural in this huge frame, but it was not retained. We had to study, make all kind of analysis with Jay to study what, and it was, it went from landmark to landfill. This is a dome we did for the Lyric Theater. We put it on wheels, and actually it was 1 inch too tall to go through the tunnel, so we had to get a permit to go through the bridge. This is the proscenium arch at the Apollo had to be removed out of 78 pieces because of the configuration of the metal and the brick. So we could not go back to the job site and install 78 pieces. So what we did is that we grouped them together. This corner here, that was three section of 3, that was 9 pieces put together, 9 pieces put together. You can see the domes are made in half, columns. We had to create new fabric, so to create new fabric, we had to cast the dome on an exploded visions. You can see that those metal frame in which those small domes, they are still in those cages for the production of Harry Potter now. All the domes from the under-ceiling balcony from the Lyric are hanging on the backstage right to the rafters. And this is what we did. That's how we did it. We took all the moldings and then we laid it down on a flat surface. We verified and we created a metal structure that was epoxied in. That's why I wanted to show you this one, because no access to it for quite a while. Exploded version of the dome for paint removal. The paint removal was quite painstaking, but it really worked quite well. And you see how we assembled. Those little pieces you see here are called butterflies. They're perfect. They are to have a perfect alignment, because in making it 10 feet wider, we had to find the original geometry because they were not parallel. They were concentric rings, concentric arches. So that was quite a bit of a challenge to find, and I did it the old way with a string and a pencil. It does work, you know. Here we're trying to make it work, trying to find a better way, a faster way, and no such luck. No, it was just a lot of... This is when we went back to install it. You can see that forest of metal. Installation, templates. These were the original pieces all put together. All the system. Pizza slices of the dome, you can see. The rest was filled up with plaster. We didn't have ornamentation, but they were hosted in place and welded. This gives you an idea of the number of come along to have, because what happened was that we ended up not having the proper dimensions for the columns, so everything had to be reset by hand. The dimension, we triangularized our dimensions, but the GC did not take in consideration, so none of the measurement worked, and they had lost our templates, so we had to do it by hand. And at the end of the day, we're only an inch difference on each side, which you cannot see. But now you know. Still that's still the cell vault, and thanks cell vault again, and the balconies. Those balconies have been removed 3 times. And as you can see, opening in December 97, yeah. Reinstallation of the cell vault. And as you can see, this is how it went. And the dome. The only change in the dome was that large elliptical effect, but all the rest is strictly original. We made no mold, no... This is just, it was a... no. Anyway, this was just a poster we did at the end to thank everybody in the project. So you should have the names of all the contractors and our fellow contractors on this project. But it doesn't want to come up. Okay. Now we're going to switch to our last project, most current project right now, which is the Times Square Theater. So you can see that this is a very exciting project for many different reasons. This is the first time that it reminds me a lot of the Pyramide du Louvre and or the diamond that we have in Toronto, where you do the integration of a new building into the old building. So what we have here is that you will have the whole facade has been lifted up. And it's all glass. You can see the dome here, and you'll be able to see it from the outside. You can see the whole structures change and the flow of the people with the newly placed plaster. It's the first time that a theater on the block will not be a theater any longer. It will be a shopping mall. They will actually have 20 feet in the basement, digging. I don't know if you know how difficult it is how to dig into New York's graphite schist. It is an amazing difficulties. And you can see that it represents a lot of very complicated issues with structural issues, plaster, putting everything back in action. This is the dome. And all those projects is done with John Tidman. We haven't had a chance to talk about new technology in the little time we have, but I would just let you know that even though plaster can be saved, there is no such a thing as the plaster is old, we must replace it. This is a very commercial approach by non-preservationists. As a preservationist, I can tell you that I have never seen a plaster we could not save. And I had the pleasure of working with John Tidman on many different projects, with Jay Cardinal, and we can tell you that, Angel Hayon as well, that it is absolutely salvageable. Whether the will is there, it's a different story, but plaster is salvageable. By all means. This is the work in progress. We've had quite a few surprises, but, you know, once again, each plaster shop had their own, you can see on the left here how we develop a structure with epoxies. These are part of the canopies. This is the team with Sanika here that actually has put this slide together for us with Mary Ennis. Jay is not here because he took the photo. And here we are, you know. Wow, it quit. Well, I guess that will be us. That'll be all for tonight.
I'm still not clear on, after, let's say, you accomplish the dome, how does it adhere to the ceiling? And what method is used?
Very carefully.
You said it was, no, you said it was welded, but
Yes. Well, what happened is that...
weldable?
No, of course not. What happened is that we have structural engineers that actually design a structure which is applied onto the plaster. The method of attaching the structure to the plaster depends on the existing steel that you have on the plaster. Most of the time you have black iron, or we can actually integrate steel and black iron to be hanged. What is hanged to, it's another structure that has been put in place for this application. So it's not the plaster you weld, it's actually the metal structure that was applied onto the plaster through hangers and seismic hangers as well, to a substructure that is attached to the roof. So we go beyond the plastering. This is the plaster part of those projects is the simplest for us. We leave that part to architects and structural engineers.
One of the things you pointed out was, of course, that plaster, or this particular technique using burlap and plaster and other wood, other materials that are very sensitive to water and biological action. In this modern era where so many high-tech materials are being designed, are you seeing or considering a synthetic fabric as opposed to burlap and forward to restoration so projects will last longer?
Oh, absolutely. Very good question, because actually the New York Building Code changed the law in the sense that you're not allowed anymore to hang fibrous plaster with non-mineral materials. It must be fiberglass. You still can make a burlap cast, which is as long as it's not suspended with burlap. But you have many different fiberglass that can be used. And it's definitely the future.
Hi, I had a question about restoring existing plaster that maybe have been subjected to water damage. Are you using epoxies or heat to dry it out, or what are some of the techniques and options you're using to restore something that's of antiquity or historical value?
The first thing you must do when you have water plaster damages is try, if you have, let's say, a leak above your ceiling, you make a little wee hole to pick up the water, and you have ventilation and heat. The air must circulate to actually dry the plaster. And depending on that, it depends how much salt you have. There's a complete methodology you can follow. But even if the plaster has suffered extended water and repetitive water damages, if you see those white fibers that look like cotton candy, white cotton candy, they're actually salt. They can be removed, and you must use the appropriate product, because the salt, unfortunately, is a nasty screen on which most plaster will not bind. So Zinsser has a white pigmented shellac that can be used as a screen, and then it depends on your actual abilities on what plaster you'll be more familiar to work with. Drywall compound actually was developed in the 1900s, 1915, 1920. It was simply developed to replace the top coat on the lime plaster because it was so messy and so wet.
Francois, how did you develop an affinity for theaters, and what are the challenges, if any, in finding artisans to work with you?
Well, I must say that theater represents the best of the architecture, in the sense that you always have an effort in the architecture itself. The vocabulary of a theater is always a geometry that's always a challenge, an ornament that's always rich, and you have it's, I don't know, it's the old building that has, so it's like an old church. You know, it's, there's a great satisfaction when you have finished a job and you look at the theater that was in derelict, and it makes you happy that it's not a parking lot. No, because so many became parking lot, and people throw the sponge. No, it cannot be saved. That's not true. That's not true. I mean, you're in New York, call Tidman. They'll fix it for you. No, seriously, there is that need of selling new product, of drywall. If you live in a plaster house and you move into a drywall house, you will feel it right away. The acoustic is different. There's a lot of things to be said for the quality of plaster.
I'm Italian, and first of all, congratulations. You are not an artist, you are a real artist.
No,
what
no,
you are doing is so unique.
Io non sono artista, io sono stuccatori.
Okay. Okay. But my question is, given your craftsmanship and all the artwork that we have in Italy and the needs of restoration in Italy, what made you move to Canada? You didn't have enough work, or your parents, enough work in Italy?
It's really simple. It's because of her. You should know that most of the postmodern, in the history of plaster, after the 1900, a huge diaspora of the Italian master either went to Scotland or came to America. The one that came to America came to New York, and this is where you have such a grandeur of architecture in New York City. And then in the 30s, after the Depression, they moved to California to do movie props. And this is why in Italy they got completely depleted. My grandfather was from Viterbo. My uncle Dario, what I'm after, my name is Jean-Francois Dario Furieri, actually won the Biennale of Venice in 1940. And he left a lot of work in Viterbo, Italy. So it's the fate of things with the wars, and people move and the changes, but you should know we go back to Italy with the greatest pleasure.
I have a question about stripping paint off of plaster. You had said that a lot of the materials used, like zip strip or those kinds of things, are really hard on the plaster. Do you have a recommended stripper, or what's the best way to get the paint off?
The best material to use is something that's non-alkali. Is very important, but now we live in a green age, and a lot of product will require a lot of patience. What you must not use is a water-based water paint remover, because plaster is paint soluble. And even though it doesn't say it, but sometimes methyl hydrate will help you clean your plaster, and you must allow drying stages in between. By working on a piece of plaster and trying to work non-stop, you will actually wash it off and kill all the edges. There are products such as Pilowe 7, Back to Nature 7, which are non-toxic and require a lot of patience because they do not the work that used to be done a lot faster with potassium product. But in the other hand, it's a lot safer. And by the way, plaster has been green before green was green. And you should know that in my dad's factory, we had farmers that would pick up all our dead plaster and you use it as a fertilizer. Recycling it. But to go back to the paint removal, it's a very tricky process, and you should always make a small test. Thank you.
Jean-Francois, on behalf of the General Society, we want to thank you so much for so eloquently sharing your expertise, your vast knowledge of plaster. I think you've also, for those of us who maybe know less about plaster, you've made us think about it in a different way, and you've proved the flexibility, and you've also highlighted that no building should ever be felled because of to do with its plaster. And like you are, and as a member of the audience remarked, you are a true artisan, and we are so delighted you could speak here this evening.
I'm a technician.
Okay, you are, well, it depends on the definition. Jean-Francois says he's a technician, but we also feel that he qualifies as an artisan. So, Jean-Francois, we would like to make a presentation to you, if we may, and to do so is our Executive Director, Victoria Dangle.
Yes, and I echo Karen's sentiments. Thank you. Thank you so much. I know we'll never be looking at our plaster in the same way again. So thank you for that. And also your love. I love the way you express plaster. All plaster can be saved. And I feel like we should all be ashamed of ourselves if we do otherwise. So yes, from now on, we're with you with that cause. So on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to Jean-Francois Furieri, President and founder of Iconoplast, for his lecture, The Restoration, Preservation, and Conservation of Architectural Ornamental Plaster, for his participation in the General Society Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. But we also do an artisan lecture series, and I'm also throwing that in there, and the artisan lecture series. So thank you so much for your contribution.
Wow.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
To be part of this is very, very touching.
thank you, Jean-Francois. And we've also made you a lifetime member of the library for you and your family. So please come back and visit.
I certainly will.
Thank you.
A final thank you to Jean-Francois. A thank you to you for attending this evening. I hope you will now join us for a glass of wine. I'm sure Jean-Francois would be happy to answer more questions, and to mention that I hope you'll come back for our final landmark lecture in June. Thank you so very much.